A couple of things that I was looking for is where is there agreement on an approach? And as you know, there wasn't always agreement initially on an approach or a strategy. I also was interested in how did we get here? What has been tried in the past and has worked or not worked with this coalition, with its activist base? What are things that have proven successful over time? Things like that were part of the one-on-one conversations, I think helped inform a broader strategy.
Today, we're talking with George Rakis, a longtime political campaign and advocacy strategist. George has decades of experience running electoral campaigns and independent expenditure campaigns and overseeing big electoral projects for the Democratic Party. George and I met when he took on a national advocacy campaign to win the first ever carbon pollution standards in the U.S., and we've been friends ever since. George taught me a lot about campaigning, particularly how to integrate tactics and tools that political campaigns use, and I'm really glad to welcome you to the Campaign Strategist. Welcome, George.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on one of your inaugural episodes. It's really cool that you're just launching this, and I'm honored that you picked me to be one of your first interviewees.
Thank you for being one of my first guests. Before we launch into the details, just tell us a bit about how you ended up getting involved in political campaigns to begin with.
I had been working on Capitol Hill in many different roles for a short period of time, maybe 2 years. I had watched members of Congress and their chiefs of staff handle things differently. In particular, I watched two similar members who were into some scandal and how they handled it. One handled it very not well, and one handled it really well. And I thought, wow, a lot of other members handle things poorly, not well, and it impacts their elections, and I think I can do something about that. And so I decided to leave the Hill and go into electoral politics. I think at some point I had planned maybe on returning, but I just never did. And after that, I spent like 20 plus years just doing elections and nothing else.
So I guess you liked it.
I liked it. They say people go into politics in order to control their own environment. I think there was some of that. I'm very good at being self-employed and self-directed, even though there's always a boss in everything. I think the self-employment piece and being the person accountable and responsible was something that I really liked.
You worked on electoral campaigns for years before taking on the climate policy advocacy campaign. Talk to me about the similarities and differences between those two kinds of campaigns. What are the differences when it comes to devising the strategy, and how do you develop strategy? And what are the other big differences that you noticed?
I distinctly remember that cap and trade had failed. And at the same time, every day on TV, I was watching 1 million barrels of oil being spilled into the Gulf of Mexico and thought to myself, well, wait, how come we can't pass a climate bill when the biggest piece of pollution in modern history is happening every single day on the news? And there are a lot of really good reasons why, which I did not know at the time and did not fully understand at the time. But I thought to myself, wow, you know what? I think I could do a better job advocating for some type of climate policy. And it was interesting because there are very good reasons why, cap and trade didn't pass. I didn't know at the time. I thought if I bring my campaign skills to this effort, maybe we could be successful. And that's how I ended up there. It was mostly like a negative. And when I arrived, you may recall this, national environmental groups were really, their own self-esteem was pretty low from having failed at that. I liken it to, hiding under the table, because it's like they were put into a bunker mentality. And you may remember this, but that was the year that National Journal had called them the biggest losers of the year, or one of the biggest losers of the year. I was looking at it, I was like, wait a minute, these guys got awfully close. They're on the right side of history, and they're doing the right thing. And they have a huge membership of activists that will actually take action on this issue of climate and can get something done as long as we can all get out from under the table and start working. It was really interesting because I thought, wow, all of the raw materials are here for a really good campaign. Well-financed, strong activist base, organizations that are connected and have influence, both in the courts and in Congress and in the Obama administration. I thought that all the raw materials were there, and it was a matter of sort of figuring out how to piece it all together.
I think dispirited is a fair way to characterize how not only Enviros felt, but also our Hill allies and others. I was part of the small coterie of folks who worked on cheerleading the idea that, okay, well, the next best thing we can do is get the EPA to issue regulations under its authority, which at the time the Supreme Court had affirmed, but it hadn't really been tested yet. So talk about your strategy setting approach and what are the differences between if you're working on an electoral versus an advocacy campaign?
I would say the biggest difference is there's no election day. There are folks who have been advocating for immigration, for example, for 10 or more years, climate, 10 or more years. It just doesn't end in November. And so pacing yourself and your organization is kind of important because folks can get really burned out from campaigning all the time, especially when you bring an electoral background. You're working all the time till 10, 11 o'clock at night, no matter what, because there's a hard deadline with election day. You can't really push people that hard on something that is going to last more than 10 or 12 months.
Yeah, that may not have an
Yeah.
end date or doesn't have a clear
Yep.
end date. For an electoral campaign, you're building strategy around who are the voters we need to engage and motivate and mobilize and persuade so that we have, we get 50 plus 1% of the vote on election day. How do you go about setting strategy for an advocacy campaign and figuring out, okay, what do we do here?
The coalition had a very specific goal with the Clean Power Plan. In a lot of ways, getting that done was the ultimate goal and mission of the organization. And so that made it sort of easy to look at different approaches and strategies and how best to apply a strategy. I think the hard thing, and I really learned this by working on political party coordinated campaigns, that there are a lot of stakeholders in those. Mostly they are elected officials, and that coordinated campaigns are more or less a coalition organization, or at least they used to be. And that sort of prepared me to deal with a coalition and sort of figure out a way to apply a strategy, but not a strategy in a void, but allow them to be part of the strategy making of the campaign, right? A lot of people think, well, people just sit down in a dark room and write a strategy. Actually not, right? There are a dozen organizations that have already been working on climate for more than a decade. They are the stakeholders of this, operation. And so involving them and getting their points of view into a strategy is hugely important because ultimately they would be responsible for executing parts of the strategy. And I thought that background had helped me and also helped create a lot of buy-in into an approach.
So what did you look for in those conversations?
A couple of things that I was looking for is where is there agreement on an approach? And as you know, there wasn't always agreement initially on an approach or a strategy. I also was interested in how did we get here? What has been tried in the past and has worked or not worked with this coalition, with its activist base? What are things that have proven successful over time? Things like that were part of the one-on-one conversations, I think helped inform a broader strategy, right? Because if it was an electoral campaign, we would be looking at vote history, electoral history, what's happened in previous campaigns, what's changed between, the last time somebody won this office or, a Democrat was in this seat, what hasn't changed. It was sort of the same process. Some groups were like, no, that member shouldn't be targeted because they suck or they'll never be for us. That's a state that we shouldn't even bother to be in. And so there was a lot of conflict.
So defining targets was a big part of it. And I recall we kind of had like almost a two-phase targeting thing. Like the first task was we needed to get the EPA to be willing to put out regulations, and that required having President Obama's support. When we started, climate was not really on his agenda or not very high on his agenda. He was busy with the Affordable Care Act, but he'd also, as an Illinois legislator and as a U.S. senator, been pretty accommodating toward coal. We didn't know where he would really be on the issue. So that was one thing we had to work on, is how do we get them more enthusiastic about taking action? The other set of targets was, once a regulation passed, Congress has the power to pull it back. And we focused throughout on who were the senators that would have that ability and how do we define those.
How do we neutralize them or get them to our side?
Once you know the targets, then you got to figure out what's going to motivate them. How do you get them on your side? There's the overarching strategy. There's how do we move the White House? And then how do we move senators? And those were interrelated as well. Like it mattered to the White House.
If we had those senators on board. And
exactly.
We really took the time to examine in those states what the senators had said and not said about climate change, what they had done before. We polled in each of those states to figure out what the right message was to move the public and therefore the senator. We actually did a lot of research like that. And then I think we sort of figured out where we wanted to engage to have the most impact. I'll tell you what, like we also relied on lots of other organizations that were doing lots of other work. Like this was at the same time as the Keystone Pipeline campaign. We didn't have to take the same approach that they were taking. They were doing fine, protesting out in front of offices and doing sit-ins, whatever sit-ins in offices and the like. We didn't have to go there. We could have more of a communication strategy. And that was one of the things that we did was we deliberately said, let's create communications on climate change to show these senators that it is a mainstream subject in their states. And let's not worry about the New York Times and the Washington Post. Let's worry about those B markets that they are concerned about. Literally, we generated, a ton of local news clips, and not just in the print media, but TV and radio coverage, and lots of it. When I'd go meet with the chief of staff of a senator and they'd say like, yeah, this is not a really big issue in my state, I'd pull out the binder and I'd say, well, that's funny. We've had 15 articles in the last quarter just on this subject matter and the impacts on your particular state. And they'd always be like, what? Like, well, yeah, aren't you paying attention to the media in your state? And then in some cases, we actually knew if there was a senator or a staff member who was responsible for reviewing the clips of the state every day. And so we would make sure that that individual saw all the news we were generating around climate change in the state. Mainstream subject and happens to have a lot of impact on what's happening in your state. And that also helped with the White House. They could not ever focus on, the Austin American Statesman. They were focusing on larger media outlets. When I would go in there and show them that in these states that are swing states that you see as problematic, this has become a mainstream subject because we're getting regular news coverage on it and its impacts on the state.
I felt like you were kind of transplanting lots of approaches from the electoral world into advocacy, which is what taught me a tremendous amount. And so using the same pollsters that the targets
use the same pollsters
used,
that the targets
right? So they would believe it.
If we had data that showed that we were, right or whatever, they would end up sharing it with their clients, whether we wanted them to or not. Right. So even if polls came back and said, yeah, people don't give a shit about climate, that was a risk that we took. Sharing a pollster with the senator proved to be really a good idea.
And then the frequency of communications was another thing, as well as the level of access you were able to create, because I don't recall a lot of campaigns where we were meeting with chiefs of staff. But in terms of really getting a bead on where is this office on the issue, what are they thinking about? And is there some specific thing that they're never going to say out in public or in a committee hearing or something, but that we can learn and address? So that level of communication and making sure they were seeing the products of the advocacy that was being done.
There's no guarantee that the elected official or the chief of staff or top of the food chain would see that stuff unless we made an effort to make sure that the right person saw all of that work. And I'll tell you, that actually had a lot of impact and influence on the White House. We had figured out was that the Obama White House spoke campaign. A lot of their outreach, a lot of the White House staff came from the Obama campaign, and we spoke the same language as they did. They were into the grassroots. Well, guess what? The environmental community has great grassroots. Let's show them, that we're able to mobilize the grassroots. That from a public opinion standpoint, the public was on our side of the issue. Let's show them that in a way that they would understand. And then, when we started to go door to door and do phone contact, they were interested in that, right? They weren't just interested in how many people signed the petition. They want to know, well, how many people did you actually talk to, whether they signed the petition or not, right? Like they were looking at thinking campaign metrics. And we were saying, we have campaign metrics, we can measure everything. And here they are in your own language. And I thought that was helpful. And some of the Senate offices were the same way. They were either up for re-election or getting close to election time, and they spoke that language also for that period.
How did being able to come back and talk to them about that, affect actual conversations? Oh, we knocked on 1,000 doors and got, this many reactions of this nature. How did that actually translate into a better understanding of where that office was, or maybe movement?
This was us trying to move them and show them that you have a constituency in this state that really cares about this issue, right? If you think about this, an EPA rule on carbon emissions from power plants is the most boring thing on the planet. They didn't expect excitement and enthusiasm around something that boring, but we went out and talked to people. We got them to take action. We went beyond our usual base of activists and started activating other people like nurses, right? And school nurses in particular, who have to deal with asthma in the classroom all the time, and principals who had to shut down schools because of weather incidents. In Michigan, we talked to a manufacturer whose supply chain was screwed up because of incidents of extreme weather, who were all willing to go on the record to say, yeah, this is a problem for us and it hurts our state.
This is a time, in terms of climate messaging, that one of the things I'm proud of is that a role I played in shifting how advocates talked about climate as a problem. This is something that has been struggled with since, the 90s. And I remember we'd get book after book every couple of years about here's how to, talk about it like it's a blanket, talk about it like it's a greenhouse, how to frame it. And the previous campaign where we weren't able to actually get the vote in the Senate, the most prominent messaging was about clean energy jobs, green jobs, which seemed promising at the time, but they were ephemeral to people. Like people didn't know what the hell they were. And they were sort of future promises. After the Senate bill failed, one more new study came out connecting higher temperatures to incidence of asthma. At NRDC, we had a public health and climate expert on staff, and I was able to get with her and then in our communications team, and we did some of the first message research, focus groups, and polling to test out how does talking about asthma work? And man, that was powerful. Way better than talking about polar bears or annual interdecadal incremental increases in average nighttime temperatures, stuff like that, which is what we had been talking about.
And it was instrumental in having the American Lung Association be an active member of the coalition. And that was really important. Yeah. They were all about public health, and they totally got it and became a very active member of the coalition because of that work.
That was really also powerful in terms of being able to show members of Congress that politically we had a way of holding them accountable, because they'd never been exposed or the subject of ads before that said, because you voted this way,
people suffer.
This little kid is going to suffer. This little poor kid in a respirator
is going to suffer. That's right.
Is going to suffer. And that was one of the things that also differentiated this campaign from previous ones that I'd worked on, where accountability hadn't been a big focus, but it was a really big focus for this campaign.
We were able to come to scale in a couple of states on some of those ads where, no, this is not an ad that's going to show on CNN 3 times and we get some press coverage. We're doing 1,000 gross rating points this week on this particular subject. And by the way, we're the only advocacy campaign on the air holding you accountable for this vote. And so that was actually pretty powerful to do that. And that was a tough decision for the coalition to make. Remember, we actually had to have quite a few conversations about what that would look like and how we would do that, especially since we did the work with the brands of the coalition, right? So it wasn't like I could just say, okay, we're doing this ad, let's go put it on the air. It had to pass quite a few vets in order to get in the air.
I remember the first one that the coalition ever did, did pre-polling and post-polling. It was aimed at Scott Brown in Massachusetts. And there was also then evidence that the ad that was run castigating him, I forget exactly which vote it was, but it was like an anti-climate vote. And it moved his favorability, which seemed to really get his attention and got other people's attention as well.
I think almost every time we did that, we got members' attention. And we also did the opposite, right? Remember Kelly Ayotte, right, who voted our way several times. And she was pleasantly surprised that we did positive ads talking about the work she had done and would tell other members. And her chief of staff became a third-party validator for us with other Republicans, some Democrats, and I thought that was pretty powerful at the time. And it was because she did the right thing. And we showed that we can use both the stick and the carrot.
And we worked together we ran ads like these also focused on Rob Portman, who had introduced some kind of dumb amendment that was anti-climate. We were really going after Kirk. But I do remember after we ran that ad, Portman's chief of staff in a Senate caucus meeting griped about that ad and talked about, just said to their leadership, you want us to keep taking these votes, but these guys have got money and they're hitting us hard. And I thought that was reflective, both because we rarely had that kind of insight. And I do want to talk about, without getting into too much detail, this is one of the other things that I recognize that you brought to the campaign was you enlisted people who came from the electoral world, who had deep relationships with people on the Hill that could get information that, wasn't going to come up when an environmental lobbyist went to an office. That's how we got insight into, wow, these certain things we're doing are really having an impact.
Yeah, I did. I recruited some people who, like the pollsters, for example, that was one. And then I recruited a couple other folks who did media for several senators, so that they could tell us why a senator was on a particular vote or a particular issue was the way they were. They wouldn't say to us, and therefore you should do X, Y, and Z, but they would explain to us what the issues were, and we can go out and tackle them, right? Nobody cares about this.
Right.
Or, there's no constituency in my state for this. Or nobody's organizing around this. Well, we are, right? We've got 20,000 signatures on a petition. These are 20,000 people and are able to email them at the drop of a hat, right? God, we collected 1 million emails from various states that allowed us to communicate communicate with folks that you think they may only have just signed a petition, but no, they're actually now activists, and we now have them and are able to mobilize them. I thought that was pretty powerful too.
I mean, that and the comment drive that generated several million comments in support of the EPA rule, which is,
But the data gathering on that
one
was
of the,
really important, right? Like what states they came from, what their
yeah,
email addresses were, and being able to continue to communicate with folks that took that action, I thought was really
yep.
important.
What I found so interesting is, just understanding how important intelligence is in terms of understanding what's motivating the target and then adjusting your campaign to address what it is that they need or what it is they want to avoid in order to move them forward.
One Senate chief of staff told us, oh, well, I'm getting from the Chamber of Commerce 100 calls a day on this bill and nothing from you guys. And then one is like, okay, well, we can change that right away, right? Which we did. But also, that's funny you say that, because here are all the people in your state who signed a petition saying that they care about this issue. Oh, and by the way, here's 30 articles in the mainstream press from towns around your state from the last quarter who also care about this. And that kind of intelligence helped us turn certain things on to make sure that we had their attention.
You mentioned the importance of data and essentially audience analysis, which was also a degree of sophistication I hadn't seen before in traditional advocacy campaigns. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about applying that?
This is actually something that I think is unique, but now has become standard practice amongst a lot of advocacy groups, was that we brought the voter file into climate world, essentially. LCV, which does a lot of electoral work, had already been using it for various things. But our approach was, well, these people care about elections. We probably should be talking to voters who elect them in and out of office and not just randomly. That was a huge move, that we could identify a sub-segment or segment a list and talk to precisely the people that senators were concerned about. That was a big deal. And that has now spurned a whole bunch of other stuff. Because the voter file was new, we were able to do hygiene on all the lists of the environmental groups so they could update all their records. And that was really helpful for them. And they could do, or we could do for them, or they could do on their own, analysis of where can we find new members.
Yeah, well, I still recall the figures, your estimates and telling the groups that we've only reached or got on our lists a fraction of the overall potential support base. But give me an example of just like how you would translate understanding, here's a block of voters that are consequential from this senator's perspective. Just walk through a little bit more how you go from that to being able to then communicate with them and engage them in a campaign.
The voter file, at a minimum, has, name, address, phone number, gender. In southern states, it had race. Also, a whole lot of consumer data that we ultimately ended up buying into. So we could get rather specific on who we wanted to talk to. And there were some groups in the coalition who really wanted to talk to those segments. And so just providing the data, if we did nothing, they would go ahead and do it. If we provided content, they would use our content.
You could call them, you could knock doors, you could focus ads on those.
Digital ads in a precursor to the current iteration of Facebook, or maybe it was 3 iterations ago. There was an opportunity to network amongst people's lists who signed up to look at your content. And so that was really helpful while they had that, because like-minded people happened to socialize amongst their family and friends. And so it was sort of a quick and easy way to go ahead and reach a whole lot of like-minded folks. We were doing this as the social media world was evolving. That was really helpful because it was changing and we were paying attention to the changes they were offering and taking advantage of them. We created a lot of climate content that we recognized that the coalition's communications offices and digital offices were completely overwhelmed, having to come up with content every day about whatever the environmental issue was of the day. Several groups only used social media for fundraising purposes, right? Not for, any other type of communications. Some didn't have digital departments. It was being handled by their press or their fundraising departments. And so they were all over the map. But what we could do is, with our messaging, be very consistent, create consistent content for them that allowed them to put their brand on it and use as their own. And in the beginning, a lot of the group's communications people didn't use that stuff. But then they realized it was available. And also, we created a hub to put all this stuff onto. So if they did need to talk about a particular climate issue, that content was always available. They just go to the hub, pull it down, and use it as if it was their own. Over time, we ended up creating, I would say, the bulk of climate content outside of fundraising for all the group's that are part of the coalition. And then at some point, we also said, well, there are 100 environmental groups. Why are we only making this content free and available to a dozen of them? Everybody could use it, because the more they use it, the more the message gets out. And, there's small environmental groups in Iowa that don't have somebody creating content for them. And so, great, use our content and put your name on it. I thought that was great. We have a couple of people, their only job is to create content for you. And that's it. Or you can each hire your own people. But at the time, no one was hiring those kind of folks because, again, the social media was evolving. They weren't there yet. I think 1 year after I left the Climate Action Campaign, I was doing some work with a bunch of groups, and a bunch of them had only just that year hired their first digital content people, which I thought was super interesting.
One of the other things that you did was expanded the diversity of the coalition in terms of the types of groups that were engaged.
Because
so
that's
talk
huge,
about that.
Because the conventional wisdom was that people of color don't care about climate change. And actually, they suffer from the impacts of climate change before the rest of us. Initially, we stumbled on it through asthma when we're working with a minister, they do an annual health fair at their church. And the minister said, well, you don't understand. Kids of color suffer from asthma more than white kids. And we're like, oh, let's check that out, right? And sure enough, that's what the data said. And we went from there into just actually doing town hall meetings and communicating with people of color on this issue. Those are the first neighborhoods that flood because of sea level rise. There's the public health risk. And so there are all of these things. And it was like, oh, wow, there's an interest here. And I always tell people this: no one's going to give you their vote if you don't go out and ask them and say, will you please vote for me? We did the equivalent of saying, please vote for me. We went out and reached the community. We talked to community leaders, saw that there was an interest, and went and asked for support. And I thought that was huge. We got to the point where we're actually working with a handful of HBCUs also on this issue, which I don't think had been done before.
Of course, they're also disproportionately affected by the sources of pollution that cause climate change even before climate becomes an issue, just the regular traditional pollutants.
That's right.
It's a major concern in those communities, and one that enviros have too long just not adequately thought about.
We got to the point where 33% of the actual staff of the campaign were from underrepresented communities, which I thought was a milestone also. So it wasn't a guy who looks like me going out and talking to these communities. We actually had staff that were exactly like the people we were communicating with, which was sort of unique for an environmental group.
So what were some of the other partnerships that you engaged and formulated in?
Working with Black ministers was huge for us. That is an activist base that works on issues that the community cares about. And all of a sudden, guess what, Senator? You're now hearing from, and this is one of my things. It's not a pet peeve. It's one of the things that I like to do, which is the unusual suspects. Senator, you never hear about climate from people of color. Well, here they are. You mostly hear about nurses because of wages and, hospitals that are understaffed. We now are working with nurses who will tell you that climate change is a problem for them as well, and from parts of the labor movement. I thought that was a unique way of getting their attention. It doesn't matter if Pete comes to your office because you already know where NRDC and the Sierra Club are on all of these issues. But you didn't know about these folks. They care about it too. And they're from the building trades union, or they're from SEIU. And so in the idea of looking for like-minded people who are not engaged or not as engaged, I used to tell the staff that any child advocate working in a state, if you went to their office and said, could you please, do X, Y, and Z on climate for me? They would be totally supportive, but they couldn't do it because they're too busy advocating for children. But if you showed up with, here's a draft op-ed, if you could contact your senator, they would do it all if you helped them do it. But they couldn't find the time just on their own. And so I encourage the staff, think like that. Who else is like-minded, would want to be supportive? But guess what? They have real things that they're doing all day long. And so you got to make it easy for them. And so we work with a bunch of different groups. We're senior groups. God, in one state we had a garden club. Yeah, I feel like we practically helped launch Mom's Clean Air Force. Even though they existed before, we really helped them expand to a bunch of other states. There's not a fishing guide in the country who doesn't recognize that there's something wrong with the fish and the insects that they eat. They're coming out at the wrong times. Things are not where they used to be. And it's impacting their business. One hunter in Pennsylvania who sent me the photo, he had a deer that he'd shot and his rifle in the photo and himself. And he's like, what's wrong with this picture? I don't know. You got a dead deer? And he said, no, I'm wearing a t-shirt. Right? Hunting is a winter fall sport. When it's cold, that's when we go out and hunt. I'm in a t-shirt here hunting. right? I thought, well, that's interesting. I guess he's probably not the only hunter who feels that way. Let's see who else feels that way.
And then there were clean energy businesses or businesses that supported clean energy.
Like there were a lot of groups working on clean energy. We wanted to talk to, the coffee shop on Main Street, which had just put solar panels on, or, the fire department. That was a huge one with the forest fires that we talked to a lot of fire department organizations. But I just remember one in particular in New Mexico that these firefighters had just gotten back from Colorado fighting forest fires. And before we even ever showed up, they decided that they were going to put solar panels on the roof of their fire station because of climate change, that they were going to use renewable energy because they just came from Colorado. And when we found them, they were like, yeah, look, on behalf of our brothers and sisters who risk their lives out there, we should all be doing this. And it was like, well, that's a very powerful statement from them. So it's unusual suspects. Senator, you don't hear frequently from these firefighters unless we're talking about wages. But guess what? They're risking their lives.
And making it easy for them to express their support.
Yeah. Not everybody knows how to talk to an elected official. Show them how. It's their right.
Is there any special sauce to how you evaluate the effectiveness of your strategy beyond, you're getting intel directly from the offices? And how do you go about adapting and changing in response to the information you're getting?
Yeah, we live in a time now where everything is measurable, right? You can measure the progress of almost anything now. And that was part of our internal mantra. Let's measure everything we can. And there were some instances we would conclude, we don't know what to do with this measurement, but we're going to collect it anyway because we may be in a place in the future where this will be valuable, or technology may change and this would become valuable. And so we measured and collected data on everything, more than just our specific metrics, which did ultimately end up panning out well because a lot of that data was put back on the voter file, which the groups now had, and they could append it with information that was relevant and important to them.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of the campaign? How many organizations were involved? If you can talk about the budget, how many staff there were?
45 or 50 full-time staff and consultants who were practically full-time, plus borrowed or lent staff from the organizations, which I think accounted for maybe another 40. The FTEs, maybe it was less than that, but it was a lot because we had in some states multiple FTEs, which are full-time equivalents. And that doesn't include folks like you who were essentially part of the campaign and spent a lot of their time on it. Each of the groups had somebody like that. I think because NRDC was co-chair, you guys spent more time than anybody else, but there were people like that too. At some point before I left, we started to pull them together as a coalition also. It wasn't the actual coalition that ran the campaign, but they wanted to be part of something. And so we said, well, let's just create a coalition with them and see where this goes. And they had great ideas on, what we should be doing differently to contact people in their community. I thought was super interesting was the Catholic Church, that the Pope's encyclical came out. Catholic Church didn't have a PR firm or any, mass communications tool to sort of go out and talk about the Pope saying, you need to be saving the planet, God's creation. It was interesting that working with them to roll out that encyclical and have, a press conference at the National Press Club, have it simulcast online, get ministers who were interested in talking about climate out to certain states and in certain media markets. So if you asked me, would you ever be doing, campaign work with them? I would say no, but they became a pretty good ally and a good third-party validator for a lot of the stuff that we did. And I was just surprised that they didn't have a plan for how to roll out the encyclical.
Are there trends or tools emerging that you think are changing or should be changing how campaigners approach their work?
Yeah, it's always about money, message, and mobilization. For the most part, there are other subcomponents of all of those three things. Anytime something impacts money, message, or mobilization, whether it's a new technology, social media platform, a way to reach more donors, anything in that space will ultimately become a trend.
What is some advice you got from a mentor or colleague that influenced you?
Yeah, I got one piece of advice from an unusual source a long time ago. I was in college. We took a field trip to Washington, D.C. to meet with people in Congress and politics as part of a political science class. Lee Atwater was the chair of the RNC, and he met with us. He said, look, there's an election in this country all the time. City council, mayor, Wall Street has elections for who's on the board of a company. He says, there's always an election. He said, if you want to get good at electioning, just go out and find it, and the cream will rise to the top. If somebody's hiring an opposition researcher, go do the opposition research. If somebody's hiring, somebody to clean up the campaign office, go be that person. If you want to be a campaign manager like me, do all the jobs. Be a press secretary. It doesn't matter whether it's a city council race or a U.S. Senate race. It's funny because I followed that advice and did a bunch of different things. A communications director, an opposition researcher, GOTV director, field director, ultimately becoming a manager for several years. And I think if you said, hey, you should follow Lee Atwater's advice, I'm not the guy to do that. But it was good advice.
It's good advice. Is there something you know now that you wish you'd learned earlier?
It's a lot of work, right? Being responsible and accountable for other people's work all the time. It creates a lot of stress. Yeah, there are a lot of campaign techniques that I wish I would have known earlier. I wish I would have foreseen, social media coming and other things like that. When social media started coming up, I started meeting with people from that world to explain to me, how is this working and why is this working? And I'm not on social media. But, every year or so, I get together with people who really understood the industry and just tell me why this is becoming a campaign tool and how somebody like me can master it, even though I'm not on it.
I think the lesson from that is be attentive to what's changing and emerging, what is different today from yesterday, and find out how can you use that? How can you put it to work? Because certainly somebody will at some point.
And it's changed, and things change quickly.
I want to thank you very much for your time, George. It's been really fun.
Thank you. I hope you like it.
A different kind of conversation from our usual coffees. Thanks for tuning into the Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and see you next time.